of tonight's discussion is very much on the Dutch-Italian battle. As we all well know, there are other protagonists who are who have, let's say, taken the floor in the past days. Before I introduce tonight's panelists and tell you a little bit about the structure of tonight's event, I wanted to give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Tessa Steck, who is the Vice Director of the Royal Dutch Institute in Rome, for a very brief word of welcome. And so, Tessa, if you don't mind, I will pass the Zoom floor to you right now.
Yes, thank you, Louisa, indeed. Many thanks, Liz. On behalf of the Institute, I would like to thank you, of course, in the first place for organizing this doubtlessly stimulating seminar. Indeed, originally, this collaboration was to take place in a fully packed auditorium at the Institute near the Villa Borghese, but well-known reasons have forced us to go online. In a way, this may be a safer solution as well. Also, the Institute has felt the ripples of the clash of the recovery fund. As a good example, one Italian journalist who very regularly visited our library, he made a pretty strong statement that he would boycott the Institute and anything Dutch, excluding some Dutch persons if they would declare that they had other ideas. And also with this really nice quote that I would like to read to you. Siete la vergogna d'Europa, siete veramente dei paesi bassi. So I don't think Louisa has to translate this. So at least by going digital, perhaps we dodge some of the rotten eggs and tomatoes that would otherwise reach our premises. Indeed, the debate of tonight couldn't be timelier in the current unrest about the European budget, now from the east of Europe. I imagine that there's a different set of stereotypes at play there too. But now we'll focus on our own problems. And I will leave the virtual stage, of course, to Mark Leendekker and Massimiliano Marari. Really, so many thanks for sharing your perspective on this thorny issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa, also for giving us some local context. And the Institute in Rome, I mean, it's a historic institution. I think, I don't know if this is the first time that you received such strong reactions, but, the fact that there were people who took, kind of made the point of saying that they would boycott the Institute and any relation with it just gives you a sense, I think, of how heated passions, were this summer. So, I mean, in a way, this was, one of the reasons why we wanted to host a public discussion and host it in Rome. But I guess before we start, I mean, I think, all of you who are here tonight, and I'm very pleased to see so many people, clearly are interested in the topic. And, I don't know how much we need to review what had happened this summer, because when the European Council approved this landmark recovery package of 750 billion euros in July, aimed at addressing the crisis, the COVID crisis, including this famous 390 billion package for the recovery fund. The deal was hailed as nothing less than historic, whether by people like President Emmanuel Macron, like Charles Michel, and so on. Despite these grand pronouncements, for those of you who followed the summit, you will remember that it was very lengthy and, if anything, extremely contentious. With, at the end, yes, an agreement, but also a set of considerable reductions. And indeed, the very core of the package, this recovery fund that we're going to be talking about tonight, was reduced from its original 500 billion to 390, under the pressure of the so-called Frugal four states, most forcefully represented by Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. In this battle, Rutte's counterpart, or certainly in the depiction of this battle and in kind of dominant media representations, The counterpart became Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte. And Italy was certainly the country hardest hit by the pandemic and presented as the most in need, in July at least, of the pandemic recovery funding. But it was also kind of symbolically placed as the country very much at the forefront of the Frugal's concerns, objections. In playing the parts at the summit, Rutte and Conte in many ways reflected domestic political priorities, and we will talk quite a bit about that. But they also reenacted much longer standing stereotypes and positionings within EU politics. And hopefully we can talk a little bit about those echoes as well. The battle for the fund in many ways then offered a kind of an ideal platform, an ideal setting for rehearsing once again a whole series of stereotypes of the frugal, prudent North and the irresponsible South. So tonight, to help counter some of those interpretations, but also make sense of them, especially make sense of their uses, we have asked two prominent commentators and interpreters, media interpreters, to join us to help us, as I said, make a bit more sense of those interpretations. So let me briefly introduce them before telling you a little bit about the structure of the evening. Massimiliano Panarari, who will be our first speaker, is Associate Professor of the Sociology of Communication at the Università Mercatorum in Rome. And he's also a columnist for the Italian daily La Stampa, as well as for the weekly news magazine L'Espresso. Our second panelist is Mark Leindecker, who is a longtime Italy correspondent for the Dutch daily, the NRC Handelsblad, and someone who has also been writing about Italy for a long, long time, including about this summer's events. So what we have asked Massimiliano and Mark to do is to speak, each of them speak for slightly less than 10 minutes. We will then give them a few minutes to respond or add to what the other said, and then we will open up the floor to questions from you. Now that will be possible either through the Q&A box that you should see on your Zoom screen, and we're hoping, time permitting, to also be able to take some live questions as well. Now, since this event was originally scheduled in person in Rome, it was supposed to, the intention was to hold it originally in Italian, and we have a number of Italian colleagues in the audience as well. So what we thought we would try to do, hopefully this will work, is to do a very European thing, is to do the event in part in Italian with live interpretations. So some of you will have already been writing to our colleague Lisa Saris, who's kindly doing the technical assistance here. At the bottom of your screen, you should see, if you haven't noticed it already, if you're on a tablet, you may need to kind of touch your screen for more options. There's a little tab that says Spanish and English. It doesn't say Italian and English because for some reason Zoom does not recognize Italian. Who knows? So Massimiliano will give his opening remarks in Italian. So if you want to listen to him in Italian, click on the Spanish channel. If not, stay in the English channel and you will instead hear me attempting to do a live translation. Okay, this is, I would like to say this will be like something at the commission. I think it'll be more like something out of Monty Python, but let's see how, how we manage. After that, I would ask all of you to come back to the English channel because we will take then the remainder of the evening in the English channel and we will conduct it in English. But for the Q&A, if there are those of you who feel more comfortable asking questions in Italian, we can do that. So I will pass the floor now to Massimiliano and just say one more word before giving the Zoom floor to him. So I first got in touch actually with Massimiliano this summer because I was struck by a piece that he had written on La Stampa, like right in the midst of the negotiations, that had this wonderful title, which was Max Weber e la solita Italia papista. So Max Weber and the usual Italian papists. See, there's echoes of Monty Python here as well, okay? Which I thought summed up so nicely these competing representations, these competing stereotypes that were not just national cultural stereotypes, but also had these religious overtones. And I believe that he will touch upon some of the themes that he brought out in that piece tonight, as well as just more generally the role of the media and of political communication in multiplying and, kind of in a sense, reproducing these stereotypes and their utility in domestic political debates. All right, the floor is yours, Massimiliano. And so those of you who wish to listen in Italian, stay in the Spanish channel. Italian is Spanish tonight. And those of you who would prefer to listen in English, go to the English channel. Massimiliano.
Buonasera a tutti, molte grazie per l'invito.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for the invitation.
Gigantesco che farà e per confermare la questione che gli stereotipi esistono, da italiano per l'appunto sto facendo molto
And to confirm stereotypes, as an Italian, I'm creating all this chaos, but I promise I will make up for it in the Q&A.
Userò questi 10 minuti per cercare di articolare un ragionamento su alcuni punti.
I'd like to use these first 10 minutes to articulate some of my ideas on these points.
Italia-Olanda, ringraziando moltissimo per l'ospitalità olandese, ma in generale le relazioni complesse all'interno dell'Unione.
I'd like to reflect both on relations between Italy and the Netherlands, of course, thanking the Netherlands for their hospitality in this instance, but also thinking more broadly about relations within the EU. As political communication and political marketing teaches us, stereotypes, representations are crucial.
La comunicazione politica e la psicologia cognitiva ci spiegano che semplificare attraverso delle
Political
immagini.
communication and cognitive psychology have long argued that stereotypes and these very stereotypified representations are extremely useful in moments where particular political ideas have to be communicated in forceful terms. So in the moment of the negotiations of the Recovery Fund, when you arrive to a moment of negotiation, of bargaining, and you need to mobilize political consensus. So Lisa reminded me of the title of my editorial in the days of the Recovery Fund negotiations. So the idea of a capitalism that was profoundly bound to the Protestant ethic, that opposes itself somehow to Southern European papism. And even though, I mean, the representation of a Calvinist Protestant culture is very stereotypified, it does contain some grains of truth.
Nell'opinione pubblica italiana noi troviamo degli elementi nella lettura della realtà e nella lettura di questa trattativa esattamente nei termini degli stereotipi, proprio perché gli stereotipi, indipendentemente dal livello culturale delle persone che fanno parte di una comunità, costituiscono un cemento che unisce la comunità e che consente di leggere in maniera...
So for the Italian public following the debates, I mean, stereotypes in a sense provided a very easy or a useful reading lens to be able to interpret what was going on. And this is quite striking in a supposedly integrating European Union where we should have gone far beyond stereotypes and rather elaborated much more complex understandings of each other. And the other point here is that this was not only, presented as a crisis. I mean, that was the reading of the media, but very much a lengthy series of negotiations.
E l'Olanda come un paese duramente frugale, il che naturalmente conferma gli italiani negli stereotipi più sofisticati. Nel senso
and so in this negotiation with Rutte and the Netherlands taking this leading role of the Frugals, in many ways confirmed existing stereotypes in Italy of the position of the Dutch in Europe.
Quindi in questo c'è per l'appunto un elemento che comunque struttura e definisce la visione e la forma mentis.
So the pre-existing stereotypes certainly already prepared an Italian public for a certain interpretation of the negotiations even before they began, a certain narrative which had already been there in part.
Il primo ministro dei Paesi Bassi, Mark Rutte, è servito innanzitutto a mobilitare l'opinione pubblica. La sensazione che pur non conoscendo
the key task of these narratives was very much to mobilize domestic political opinions. There's a number of key issues here that we need to think about beyond what happened at the summit. The first is the personalization of politics and the role of distinct strategies of framing and political communication. Another issue that's crucial here is this idea of a permanent political campaign, which in Italy is very much the case. As you all know, Italy is indeed in a permanent political campaign. It is a country where we go to vote quite often. And so also with the changes that have taken place over the past years, there is a sensation on the part of all political actors that an ongoing, constant political campaign is absolutely necessary. In the case of Giuseppe Conte, in this sort of political context, the key thing was to present himself as the commander-in-chief, as somebody who was indeed in command of the governing coalition. The key narrative that had to come across in the media was precisely this role of a commander-in-chief that has an almost muscular role in commanding politics, in guiding politics. If we look at how the negotiations proceeded, we really have to understand how Conte's representation, self-representation, and also his representation in the media, how the construction of the narrative of what he did and what he managed to obtain was very much structured along these lines. And here there is a reflection that should be open also on, how this was made possible by the media system. But of course, to be able to mobilize a certain sort of opinion, there is, you draw upon a whole range of instruments, a whole range of tools. And so you use a variety of tools through a variety of sites, literally of sites of the making of public opinion, to construct a certain image, to construct, again, this image of the commander-in-chief, but also using specifically these cognitive shortcuts to reach as wide of a range of publics, of course, as possible, but to create once more this very coherent image. So if you present the idea of the Dutch as a Calvinist country, very attentive to savings, to very much the image of the frugal. This is a very easy image that can be easily shared across a range of media. Above and beyond individual political preferences. So you're speaking to a range of electorates immediately, precisely through the use of these very simplistic appeals. This sort of stereotype becomes even stronger, even more pronounced in a context that's becoming increasingly Manichaean, that's becoming increasingly dichotomous. And that is very much the characterization of the current political context. So in a political context that's very much increasingly structured in categories, the people versus the establishment, and a whole series of other dichotomies. We see this also very much in the social reading of the pandemic. So whether those that somehow recognize the gravity, the seriousness of the pandemic, and those who deny it. Again, a very kind of dichotomous reading. So when we enter into a setting for political discourse that reasons precisely through stereotypes, through dichotomies, you necessarily slip very easily into this notion of a clash of civilizations or a clash of cultures. And so the self-representation of Giuseppe Conte as the conductor, as the captain, as literally the captain of the Italian football team, counterposed to the other captain, to the other commander-in-chief, this becomes a very easy narrative to propose. And so this series of transformations that, of course, didn't first emerge this summer, I mean, what we can think of as a kind of horizontalization of public opinion allows for the further magnification of these kinds of stereotypical visions. These sorts of stereotypes also stick much more powerfully in a moment when even the forms of political communication, such as, for example, social media, serve to magnify them and further to polarize the debate. In a political debate that is very much now driven by likes. So with Conte, basically, for forwarding this idea, the bad Dutch, the frugal Dutch, the political narrative becomes very much structured through the question of, liking or not liking a particular stereotypified representation.
Cercare di veicolare in quel modo quella che è una delle tante lunghe, complesse trattative.
And apart from the choices made by political figures like Conte, this is also an easy choice for political commentators, for journalists, rather than explaining a very lengthy, a very complicated negotiation, to reduce it, to frame it within a series of quite simplistic representations. Thank you so much, Massimiliano. The floor is yours.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for this opportunity. I think it's a very nice and a good idea to try and find out what are these stereotypes behind the clash between Italy and the Netherlands. Of course, I share most of the observation about the role of stereotypes in political fights made by Massimiliano. Let's try and make some other accents. I think one of the reasons that we have seen this clash is that there is a lack of serious contact. We would all benefit from an open and sincere exchange of information. We know we live in the same European house, but we don't know each other that well. Italy doesn't know Holland quite well, except for Vermeer, of course. Holland doesn't know Italy quite well, except for tiramisu and other things to eat. So let's speak frankly, and let's not hide behind the siamo tutti amici, we're all friends, because that's what maybe ruined a lack of open discussion that's made it more difficult to overcome the let's say the differences of opinion. In a way, this is a kind of international relations therapy, I think. So let's speak openly. And as a small note on the sideline, I think it's interesting to note that this virtual meeting, already planned a long time ago, is a Dutch initiative. I am not aware of a similar initiative on the Italian side. I'm not sure if that means anything, but do the Dutch have more to lose when a bilateral relationship further deteriorates? It would be interesting to hear if somebody has any thoughts on that subject. But do we have a problem? Yes, Brussels. Yes, The Hague. Yes, Rome, we have a problem. A political fight, as we have seen, that can be healthy, it can clear the air, but what we have seen now and what we have seen this spring, continuing in the European Summit, is not a political discussion, but a mudslinging fight. We are discussing stereotypes tonight, yes, and I personally have heard and read some. For example, my neighbor and landlady, who came out and said, why is the Dutch government strangling the Italians? I could, of course, ask her why she was strangling me with all the high rents and the always additional costs, but that's a sideline. I went to the Facebook side of the Dutch Embassy, Facebook page. It's not a place where you'd expect many trolls, but there was a lot of talk about shitty Dutch, about bastards. And on the Dutch side, there was similar swearing. Keywords, pensions at 62, Dolce Vita. What are they talking about? And I have one necessarily anecdotal observation here. The Italians, when they swear, are better at history. They came up with slave trading, and even the Duke of Alba, the Spanish governor who ruled quite brutally in the 16th century in the Netherlands. But the Dutch, they might be better in avoiding threats that they are not be able to keep up with. For example, in May, the newspaper La Stampa published an opinion poll, and we've heard also in the Dutch Institute, there was some reference to that, saying that a majority wanted a boycott of Dutch products. No such thing in the Netherlands, because we know we cannot live anymore without pasta or tiramisu. So we have seen a lot of verbal animosity and antagonism. Of course, it is nothing new. That's important to understand. This is not a stereotype that's been constructed just for this reason, just for Prime Minister Conte or Prime Minister Rutte. Everybody remembers Dijsselbloem, former finance minister, former president of the Eurogroup, and he angered many people when he said, when he spoke to in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung about the rules of the European Stability Pact. I say, this is serious stuff, he said, and adding, and I quote the original in German, ich kann nicht mein ganzes Geld für Schnaps und Frauen ausgeben und anschließend sie ihre Unterstützung bitten. I cannot spend all my money on booze and women and afterwards ask your support. So that was the stereotypes have some history here. Of course, there was an angry reaction by Italy, but would it have been nice to step out of the stereotype and to show, let Italy show that it has been doing its utmost to follow the rules, to follow these rules that Dijsselbloem was insisting on, even with dire economic consequences. For example, very severe cuts in healthcare. We now see what some of the results are. And then after Dijsselbloem, we had another finance minister, Wopke Hoekstra. He requested in March an investigation by the European Commission into the Spanish and Italian public finances. Why hadn't these countries built financial buffers in better times? Crude language, bad timing, but why could Italy not step out of the stereotype and say, well, you talk about better years, but we have been struggling for years. No Dolce Vita here. Or maybe it could have remained silent, Italy, because Hoekstra was saying only what dozens of Italian commentators are saying. I'll come back to that later. So in my opinion, there were two main errors two main errors leading to stereotypes this spring, and one on the Italian side, one on the Dutch side. Let's start with the Dutch. As a Dutch guy living in Rome, I was deeply embarrassed by the lack of official empathy. We read about the German president writing a handwritten note to President Mattarella. We heard about President Macron calling in to express his sympathy, to express his sorrow about the suffering. And the Dutch, nothing. At least not that I'm aware of. No empathy, no caring words. Minister Hoekstra admitted in Parliament that he might have lacked in empathy. Has he shared that with the Italians? Not that I'm aware of. Then what I see as errors on the Italian side. I admit these were emotional months, but to demand a vague, unspecified financial solidarity because Italy was suffering was a mistake that did not take into account that one could pose some questions about how Italy would spend aid mark. These are serious questions because let's be honest, Italy does have problems. Just listen to what some well-respected Italians themselves have said. I prefer to let Italians speak, so otherwise we have these Dutch who throw in mud. Italians, Galli della Loggia, historian, he said, governing in Italy is not synonymous with doing something, changing things, but instead with occupying as much positions of power as possible with a concurrent distribution of jobs and goodies. And we had Sabino Cassese, well-respected judge and former minister. He said, we Italians, we don't know how to program, to plan, but only how to discuss and how to negotiate how to survive. This government, he said, is not in place to realize a program, but to prevent that another government could be formed. Sergio Rizzo, well-known writer, journalist, he said, this country is at its best in dramatic emergencies. At such moments, all the qualities come forward. We are the best in saving human lives. But with ordinary day-to-day administration of government, inexorably, the defects arise of a system that leaks on all sides. Also because our leaders are not always up to their tasks. We learn nothing from emergencies. We always make the same errors. And I close with Luca Cordero de Montezemolo, the guy of the fast cars and the fast trains. He said, I see a country that lives by the day. We are becoming a kind of massive parasite society, a country that only wants to create growth with assistenzialismo. I take it that Minister Hoekstra does not read Italian, for he could have his speeches written by him, by these and other Italians. So how serious is this problem, this lack of understanding? Should we worry about it? Yeah, sure. Economically, it's both in the interest of the Dutch and the Italian to have a well-functioning internal market with a strong consumer demand. And everything that prohibits that is bad for both of us. Both countries are strong exporters with the bulk of their exports within Europe. And then we have a political reason. With the Brexit, the European power system has shifted even more toward the French-German axis. And Rome may not like it, but it is an axis, not a triangle. So it's interest of both Holland and the Italians, smaller countries, to form counterweights in moments that such is necessary. Let's avoid a possible divide et impera in Europe. So what is it that we don't understand about each other? So I've tried to mention what are the most important stereotypes. I think, where do they come from? I think the Italians, well, I think that before we go in detail, it always strikes me that when you speak with the Dutch about Italians and with the Italians about the Dutch, as I said before, they don't know much about each other. It seems that we in Holland know more about the United States than about our partners in Europe, the Italians. For the Italians, the same way, and even about the French. We know more about the French than about the Italians, or the Italians know more about the French than about the Dutch. So what I should realize, what I think the Italians should realize is that there is a shadow over Dutch politics. I think Massimiliano also kind of referred to it, not with his name, but we have Geert Wilders. And to a certain degree, Dutch European policy is influenced by the desire to steal his wind. And I think this is a This is a valid objective. So Italians put public remarks and policy in this context. It would also be very bad for Italy if Mr. Wilders would become prime minister in the Netherlands. And the second observation, don't take criticism of the financial struggles too serious. Don't always refer to the frame of the Frugal. The question marks are real. And I often think that Italian commentators are even more critical, more harsh than foreign commentators. And then on the other side, what should the Dutch realize? How could they climb out this kind of this force of the stereotypes? First, the money. Italy is struggling with an enormous budget deficit and enormous debt, sure. But let's not forget that is a serious problem when you can no longer pay. That happened with Greece a decade ago. But Italy has always been able to pay its interest. And what many people in the Netherlands do not realize is that we can help at virtually no cost. If Italian debt, or part of it, is guaranteed by a creditor with strong financial ratings, say the European Commission, the interest goes lower and Italy can save billions of euro at no cost. And that, of course, should also be a reason for Italian governments to work first and foremost on their international financial credibility. Second, strategy. The Dutch have Wilders, but Italians have Salvini, and he is unfortunately stronger than Wilders. There are many differences between the two, but it is not at all in the Dutch interest to let Salvini become prime minister. So Dutch allow for some political theater, allow for some stereotypes if necessary, if the Italian government wants to try and neutralize Salvini. And third, I think there's a broader picture behind this Euroscepticism in Italy, behind this also referring or just getting over to the stereotypes, and that is migration. I think most Italians are not fully aware of the Dutch struggle with multicultural society. They don't know the degree to what we are struggling with that, with our problems. But at the same thing, and even more, let's say more important to this subject, the Dutch do not realize the problems the constant influx of migrants causes in Italy. Italy, Greece, and to a lesser degree, Spain bear the brunt of what is essentially a European problem. But the Dutch have looked away, murmuring, not our problem. In that sense, many Italians felt betrayed, abandoned by Brussels and other European countries, and we should take that into account. Well, these are my opening remarks also to get beyond the stereotypes, and maybe it took a little bit more than the 10 minutes I was allotted, but I think it's a rough sketch of what we could do, how we could try to convince being drawn also downwards by using only stereotypes and getting to understand each other a little bit better.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. And indeed, I think you made us think about a whole variety of issues that are driving these, regarding both the role of certain domestic political actors, whether it's Wilders and Baudet in the Netherlands, or Salvini and also Meloni in Italy. And those are very important. And I think Massimiliano was, hinting quite strongly at how important domestic political electoral, the permanent electoral campaign, how relevant that is. But also the question of solidarity. I mean, I have a number of questions to you, but I wanted to see if you wanted to respond to each other, especially Massimiliano, if you wanted to add anything to what Mark was saying before we go further. You need to unmute.
Sorry. A lot of the stuff, of the items suggested by Mark are very, very interesting. I think that one of the most important keys to understand this difference and this stereotype, these reciprocal stereotypes, concerns the theme, the problem of migrants, because Italy is not a multicultural society. This is true. Or better, Italy tries to become a multicultural society, but the homogeneity of culture, religion, also the ethnographic texture of Italy along the history provokes this difficulty to understand the importance of multiculturalism, like a country as Netherlands with a completely different history. The other fact also is that Italy is not really Italy doesn't have an empire. Italy was a very continental country, and therefore population was very, very homogeneous. And in a period of populism, migrants can represent really an easy adversary for political propaganda. So this is not the best period to build multiculturalism in Italy, unfortunately, I would say. The second stuff, the second very interesting stuff suggested by Mark concerns the words of some commentators like Ernesto Galli della Loggia and Sabino Cassese. I always agree with Sabino Cassese, so I completely agree with the analysis. But I think, and I try to put on the floor this other item, I think that another important difference between Italy and Dutch concerns the stability of political elite. Italy is characterized by a very often change in political elites, and after the end of the so-called First Republic, the Republic of Parties, the change in political offer, the change in leaders of parties was so quick that, in my opinion, this contributes to a difficulty in understand in the end of Italian transition in political regime. Therefore, it's very, very difficult to build a shared culture in comprehension, in understanding of Europe, and above all, in understanding of other countries partner in European Union. The lack of empathy and the lack of knowledge from Italian to Dutch, from Italy to Netherlands, in my opinion, is linked also to this very quick in political cultures and in political elites.
Mark, I don't know if do you want to respond to any of that, to add to it?
Well, maybe there's a small thing that I'd like to remark when I listened to Massimiliano and in his presentation. As I said, I agree with most of it, but it's an interesting idea that he mentioned Prime Minister Conte as a condottiere, as a knight, you might say. So he was fighting in Brussels for the Italian interest. I don't think the Dutch would have that same image of their prime minister. I would think he'll see more as a manager. So maybe that's also the frame in which this political struggle, you could say, this political fight on the recovery funds is put is different. So we saw from Italy came to Brussels a condottiere, and Rome, The Hague sent a manager. That is a different clash. So what do you do if the manager wants to discuss rational things and the condottiere wants to defend the honor? These are, I think, one of the reasons we had this clash. But that's must be now put a lot of things on the table afterwards. But maybe it's best to let other people join us and put their questions, because it should be a broader discussion than just between the two of us.
Absolutely, and I thank you for that. And we already have a couple of questions appearing in the queue, but I wanted to throw a couple more things in here, because one of the things that, I mean, we have two questions asking, you know, if it's possible to go beyond this binary frame and think beyond stereotypes and to kind of overcome some of these stereotypes, some of these binaries, also considering there is a very different historical development of both national institutions, but also, and I think, Mark, you're picking up on this, and this is very important, how you speak of politics. It's not even kind of the structuring of political institutions, but also even the metaphors that you use to describe politics. And I think, you know, this, this notion that, you know, you're raising of, you know, kind of the manager versus the condottiere is very much there. But I wanted to bring something else, and there are actually colleagues here in the audience who will be able to say much more about that that I can. But colleagues working here in ACES, in the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, together with collaborators elsewhere, conducted a really interesting survey this summer, right before the summit and right after the summit, looking at public support, public attitudes in 5 European countries, including the Netherlands and Italy, for an EU-wide pandemic recovery support instrument, you know, and the varieties that, you know, that could take. And what they found, and this is, you know, going really beyond the media representations, actually doing surveys with people, what they found is, while there were certainly differences and important ones, above all, so kind of overall, there was this feeling that some sort of support mechanism was a good idea. So this notion of a European solidarity is there somehow in potentia. It's there, and it very much depends how you articulate the question to the public, how you present the solutions, and what sort of solutions those are. But the thing that was very striking to me was that there was indeed widespread support for some sort of joint European fiscal instrument. And I don't know if any of my colleagues want to add to this, but this to me was quite striking. So very much kind of thinking that there are, you know, there are possibilities, and it's not only a question of changing the political discussion. I mean, that support is already potentially there, but it needs to be mobilized in different ways, and it needs to be talked about in different ways. So I don't know if either of you want to respond to that. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I think what you say is very important, because what do you do? What would you do as a prime minister if you have the choice to choose between various frames? You can say, okay, I know there is a potential and I build on that. Or you can say, well, I know there's also a group of people, say, current in society, who wants more antagonism. You can educate people. You can say, okay, we know there is support for helping us out. Maybe they say they want to look how we spend the money, but okay, that's not important. Of course, they want to look how we spend the money. Let's accept it. Or you could say, no, they want to let's say, reign in our capital. They want to order things like they did with the Greek. So I think Conte had a choice. He could say one way, he could go one way or the other. And maybe if you remain stuck with your stereotype, could also be a lack of courage. In that sense, Rutte has been criticized for even taking the other frame, taking up the frame. I will prevent that the money is being what is it, as given as a present to the Italians. But he could have said, and he could have explained it also, the Italians have suffered, we are helping them, but we will make sure that the money is well spent. It's a choice. In that sense, politics is also education.
Absolutely. Massimiliano, do you want to add anything to this?
I absolutely agree. Politics is also a pedagogical activity, and it's education, or at least it was education and a pedagogical activity. In the age of permanent in the age of permanent campaigning, in the age of the imperialism of communication, is very, very difficult to build this activity of education of public opinion. It's very, very difficult, and so stereotypes works in a very quick way, in a very fruitful way for political consensus. When Mark talk about the difference in the frame of prime ministers, Mark Rutte as manager and Giuseppe Conte as condottiero, we could ask to ourselves if it is a stereotype or not. I mean, to some extent, is also a stereotype, in the sense that if I think to Mark Rutte as manager, like as Italian, I think, so this is the result of the Netherlands-like country of people engaged in some economic activity from the Middle Age. And if someone thinks to Giuseppe Conte as condottiero, thinks to Italy at the same time in the Middle Age, like the country of Capitani di Ventura. This is, of course, a stereotype, but it is also a stratification, a sedimentation of cultures. So maybe we have, okay, we have to go beyond the stereotypes, and it needs empathy. Because in a very difficult period like this one, as Mark said, we need knowledge of each other and empathy also. And this is very difficult when there is an economic struggle, when there is a pandemic situation, when there is an emergency. Even if Italians are very, very even if Italy is able to do the best only in emergency, and this is a problem. I think that this is a very another very difference with Netherlands. But we have also maybe to understand this stereotype like the result of the centuries and the history, and we have to explain to the other public opinion what is the reason, I mean, what is the structure, the root, the real root of the stereotype, to develop, to change the stereotype in a reciprocal comprehension of the cultural differences.
And I think that's a really important point, because I think, you know, both of you and also, you know, a number of the questions are asking about this historical stratification and, you know, the ways in which these understandings, both of the other, but also self-understandings, have developed along, you know, kind of a whole set of national myths of, you know, whether in the Dutch case of being merchants, of being self-sufficient and all of that. And I mean, and that's certainly the case. But I think, you know, one of the things that Massimiliano, you're stressing in a couple of our questions are hinting at is there's two things, because I think there's one, the lack of empathy and understanding in a moment, especially like this one. And this moment also comes after the financial crisis, where this lack of empathy had already been evidenced. And Mark, you were, you know, noting some of the longer legacies of comments by finance ministers regarding not just Italy, but other Southern European states that somehow, you know, landed themselves in this position without thinking of, you know, some of the broader political economies that made the Euro crisis possible, that that indeed, you know, created these particular victims. So I think that's something to remember, because I think one of the interesting things is that, you know, we, in talking about the stereotypes and focusing on the stereotypes, we forget the political economies. And I think, you know, that's it's a kind of easy elision. And I think both sides tend to do that. So we don't talk about the kind of political, economic underpinnings. In the Italian context, I mean, it was curious that this summer, the only person, you know, who said something about that very quickly publicly was, you know, was actually Giorgia Meloni and Salvini himself, you know, accusing the Netherlands of being a tax haven. And talking about, you know, again, a quite unequal economic situation that had been only, you know, kind of made more prominent first through the crisis and then later with the pandemic. But I see that there is a number of questions here, both in the Q&A and in the chat box. So I'd like to see if we can take these. Let's see, I mean, we've already touched upon paternalism. I think one, I'd like to take this one because I think, you know, kind of highlighting, you know, the knowledge that both countries have or don't have about each other is relevant. So I don't know, Mark, if you can see the question. This is a question to you saying, you know, why is it that there is this lack of knowledge that, you know, most of the Dutch do not know that the retirement age in Italy is actually 67. But, you know, few Dutch people have a kind of actual awareness of, you know, the real kind of state of the Italian debt and so on. So there's a kind of a selective knowledge because there are these popular tropes that circulate about, for example, the baby pensionati and all the rest. I mean, is this also kind of a question of another set of circulating stereotypes? So what is known and how is it known?
Yeah, well, I think the problem is that there is, as I said before, there's not enough good, valuable, decent information. We are looking for facts. We're living now in a world in which social media, they blow up bubbles. We're looking in a world in which a president can just invent all kind of so-called facts. So what we need is more factual information, and we need that. We need to give that in the media. We need to use that in politics. We need to, in that sense, we need to educate the public again. And how do you do that? I think just insisting that this is the right way to do it. And not let's say surrendering and saying, well, we live in a time of mass communication and increased power of social media, so I just give up. Just defend what you're doing, and give the factual information. Say if somebody is saying, okay, it goes to pension with 62, saying, okay, that might be true, but it will end in 2021 or 2020 with the quota 100. So this was only very short, for a short period was it true, while we had this important pension reform in 2011. I think the first thing government Monte did, maybe the first day, I don't even know, I think was this pension reform. We need to know more about each other, and only that way we can have a more fruitful conversation and avoid losing time with mud throwing.
Well, you know, you're echoing in many ways what a colleague of yours, who colleagues in ACES know well, Caroline de Gruyter, has been repeating over and over again. Mm-hmm. Just the lack of knowledge about Europe, about how European institutions function, and certainly about each other. And I think that is a serious problem, because in this instance, it wasn't just a problem of not understanding much about each other and really working through stereotypes, but not also, you know, understanding very little about how the EU budget functioned, how the whole negotiation process functioned. And Massimiliano, you were noting this in your talk, where then it becomes very easy to reduce the debate to a series of kind of, you know, set frames. And so when you combine the lack of knowledge about each other, you know, the recourse to stereotypes with a lack of knowledge of how this process is functioning, I think you have a very kind of toxic combination. But we have a couple more questions that I'd like to take. One is actually, you know, whether this is the first such instance of such a clash between the Netherlands and Italy, or can you think of other moments, other events? I mean, we know that at least, you know, from our historical knowledge at the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome, I don't know if there's been a similar kind of angry response. But to your knowledge, I mean, were there other moments in early, I mean, Tessa, do you want to jump in? I mean, was this the first such instance that you are aware of?
Well, the other instance I could think of was the vandalism by the hooligans that damaged severely La Barcaccia. And the interesting difference is, of course, that afterwards there has been an initiative of Dutch citizens living in Rome or attached to Rome in many ways to make amends for that. And this is what we did not see this time. So that's already interesting.
Well, and, you know, I'd like you to stay also as part of the conversation, because I had another question related to that. But Mark, did you want to jump in on that as well?
Yeah, there was one other serious clash, not as emotional, but quite serious, and it was about the pharmaceutical, European Pharmaceutical Agency, which it is alleged that there was having foul play when it was meant to, that was Milan and Amsterdam were more or less the same weight, but at the end it went to Amsterdam, and that according to Italian sources, because the Dutch did not give the correct information. But there was no swearing and mudslinging. I mean, not to that a longer period, and I'm sure that nobody's landlady came out and said, "You Dutch are strangling us." So it was less serious, less emotional, and more superficial, I think.
Massimiliano, can you recall any other moments of kind of a flaring up of tensions?
I was thinking, but I don't remember anything. La Barcaccia was, in fact, a very, very strong, hard moment, because, of course, it was something terrible. I mean, in the sense that Italian people think themselves also above the heritage, the cultural heritage. So it was, the feeling was very, very bad. But I mean, the other stuff was the symbolic construction of the idea of the struggle against Netherlands. Of course, it's the same. It's always the same pattern in public discourse. I mean, this antagonistic frame, the binary frame, is very simplified, and of course, the most part is a fake, is false, but is easily understandable in a period in which, as Mark said before, social network represent one of the most important sources of information, of general information, of political information, public information, economic information. And in the effort to educate, inverted commas, people, in the effort of a pedagogic activity, politics is a problem. The problem, of course, is subjectivity. Netherlands Dutch know very well this idea of subjectivity, of course, because this idea of multiculturalism, for post-materialist values, depends also on the explosion of subjectivity. Individual rights, they are very important, but we know all that there is a dark side of this idea of subjectivity. It means that we can have an opinion above all, even if we don't have correct information. Means that my opinion is more important than the opinion of Mario Draghi. Of course, this is a very, very easy example. So it's important. I think that in the postmodern age, we have a problem, lack of knowledge of each other, but also as Luisa said, lack of information, but this lack of information is strongly related to this incredible expansion of the self, of the culture of narcissism. And this is very, very a problem in relation on which I think that it will be necessary really a European effort, a European pedagogical, scholastical, academic effort. It's very, very difficult.
Thank you for that. And it actually goes directly to another question that we've received through the chat from my colleague, Teresa Kuhn, who is actually one of the authors of the study that I was citing to you earlier. You know, this need to educate the European population beyond, you know, just the Dutch and the Italian voters, to really educate Europeans. Because one of the, you know, really interesting and important aspects of that study is that it showed, even in a moment of extreme crisis, I mean, this is, you know, if there is one moment of crisis, it's certainly this one, there was a sense of solidarity. And so that solidarity exists, the willingness to share risks, to share financially, to share healthcare costs and a whole variety of other things, that's very important. So then the question goes, if we need to communicate that, if we need to indeed educate, the problem seems to be much more at the level of the communicators, of the political elites, rather than even, you know, kind of the European population that already has, again, in potentia, this willingness to go forward this. And so I guess the question to you is, what should be done? How do they not give in to the wielders, the Meloni, the Salvini? And now, I mean, if we want to kind of link this to what is happening with the Polish and Hungarian threat to veto, you know, there too, I mean, these governments are working against the best interests of their populations, you know, and very ably playing the game with the support of people like Meloni, certainly, who was, you know, just today tweeting about the fact that, you know, here it is, you know, the European kind of God, what did she call it? Some, you know, kind of the European cabal, basically threatening Polish and Hungarian sovereignty, threatening their attempts to, you know, protect European Christianity and European civilization. How do you not give in to that if you are in a permanent electoral campaign, which is what both of you are saying?
It's a very, very difficult to find an answer, but I think that one of the possible solution concerns political economy, as you said before, in the sense that there is, of course, a change. The change is extremization of symbols against political economy in troubles. Giorgia Meloni, I don't know precisely Geert Wilders, and I don't want to make a mistake, but of course, Giorgia Meloni, Viktor Orban, a lot of Matteo Salvini, a lot of populist leaders play on this level. I defend Christianity, I defend values, I defend identity, because this is the only possible exchange against a difficult economic situation in which they are not able to find a realistic and pragmatic solution. But as we know from the American lessons, from Reagan onward, this symbolic exchange is very fruitful on consensus building. For example, I live in the Midwest, I'm a redneck. Donald Trump or Ronald Reagan are not able, and above all are not interested in the redistribution of wealth. They are, of course, not interested in building a different wealth, but they are able to say to me that I need a protection, a symbolic protection, that I risk to become a minority, that white supremacism is a solution. So I think that this is an important stuff to understand and to try to resolve. There is a problem concerning political economy in Europe, and there is also a cultural problem. For example, coming back to the stereotypes. What is debt for Dutch people? What is debt for Italian people? What is debt for German people? What is debt for Greek people? In this, there is in this combination, there is the interrelation between cultural level and material level. We could quote an ancient philosopher with a white bird who was saying about the relation between structure and superstructure. So this is a real problem for a European institution. There is a cultural discourse, and there is also the dimension of welfare, of European common welfare.
Mark, did you want to add anything to that before we?
Yeah, a small observation. Massimiliano mentioned also the cultural aspect of that. I have been personally involved with efforts to try and set up a kind of European platform for media, be it a newspaper or exchange of information. Very, very difficult because of the language, most of all. But I'm very much in favor of any cultural initiative that crosses border. I mean, that remains within Europe. There's now too much lines between France and Italy, Germany and Italy, Germany and US, France and US, Italy and US. So we would need to try and form a kind of European culture. Whatever that is, let's see where it ends up. Let's at least try it. In that sense, it's interesting to see that what happens now at Netflix. Netflix is forced to produce Italian series, Dutch series, French series. I think we could follow that road and try and force people to produce European series. You see now sometimes co-productions. I think this is part of what we should try and do and increase at least the platform for better understanding. So at least I know what a Swedish house look like. I know what Italian cities look like because I've seen it on television, not because I've learned it, but because I internalized it by sharing part of the culture. I think that is very important.
And I think, creating this sort of familiarity, it may seem very banal,
exactly.
And yet it's really important. And in fact, we just had one question in the chat. It's with one of our attendees noting that, okay, there are these clashes. They usually manifest themselves in, during football matches. But, many Dutch people go to Italy on holiday. Italians love coming to Amsterdam, and I can confirm that. I used to think that Italian could be my secret language when speaking with my family, but no, everybody understands us, every shop we go into. So indeed, I mean, what is the role of cultural institutions and such as the press, but not only. So, I mean, I think that would be a very important initiative. The question is, how do you do that? Both in terms of, going beyond national boundaries and national restrictions, but definitely something important. I wanted to take one more question that has been pending that goes back to some of the historical relations that still have their echoes. And this is a colleague from the University of Amsterdam, Tamar van Kessel, who's asking whether some of the almost colonial relations that there have been between the North and the South of Europe, I mean, if thinking about some of this past can help us understand how this clash is perceived. So, sensation of paternalism, for example, and especially in the case of Italy, does Italy still suffer from this sense of coloniality, having for centuries, and Rome, I mean, is a perfect example of this, not only been controlled by foreign powers, but more recently been the playground of Northern archaeologists, antiquarians. Tessa, I'm looking at you. You can tell us something about this. Writers, holiday makers, who saw only the Italian past and not its present. So in a sense, kind of pushing Italians to somehow having to justify themselves as being sufficiently modern, sufficiently advanced. And so I think it's a question both, to the Italian and the Dutch side, I mean, is this still a kind of a set of perceptions of Italy as a holiday playground and as a place in the past? Tessa, do you want to add anything to that as a Dutch archaeologist in Rome?
Well, I do think that our institute may play a role in this, resolving these issues, of course, or at least we could try. I do think that direct interaction is of the essence. So, and indeed, engaging in academic interactions, but perhaps also trying to reach other parts of the public. And that is something that's particularly difficult. So you get, I think one of the main challenges would be to include groups that actually, well, that we wouldn't be preaching to the choir, so to say. So this is something that's really, we're not a cultural embassy, but we are very open to initiatives and to new ideas, how we could help this.
Well, and I think, you know, Mark's idea for some sort of cross-European press platform, if I'm understanding you correctly, or, you know, different forms of cultural exchange would already be important. But I'd be curious to hear from both of you, Massimiliano and Mark, how those longer kind of legacies of, you know, almost, if not fully colonial, paternalistic relations between Europe's North and South, fueled by these persistent still imaginaries, which are, you know, undoubtedly still with us, even in tourist depictions. But tourist depictions are very important. They matter. How, you know, if those are still very much at play, if also, you know, in justifying some of the defensiveness and the need to say, well, we're not like that.
If I could say something, tourist depiction is very important, above all, after in the post-pandemic society. I think that this will be a very fundamental driven to build a more united European Union. So we have to be very careful to the possibility after the emergence of pandemic situation to try to analyze and try to rethink the touristic fluxes and above all the images, the imaginary of tourists. But concerning Italy, I think that there is a problem in relation with modernity. I mean, all this imaginary neocolonialistic archaeological Winkelmann stuff like that is very something very linked to a not completely true idea, of course. But Italy has a problem with modernity. Rome, for example, you know Rome, you live in Rome. Rome is the capital of Western country, but with living conditions very dramatic and terrible. So this is another kind of clash of civilization with some truth, because modernity is Lutheran and Calvinist reform, is capitalism, is a very complete liberal political system. And of course, Italy passed through pre-modernity to post-modernity in a very quick way. And our relation with modernity is quite a problem. Of course, this is our problem. And I think that this is this is something that the Italian political elite has to solve, has to rethink. Because, of course, if we want change, or better, if we want to integrate the image of Italy as archaeological heritage, we need a different relation with modernity. Of course, history and being a latecomer in unification in modernity is one of the roots of this difficulty.
Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, shortly. I think I agree with Massimiliano saying that Italy has at least a different conception of modernity than the Netherlands. Luckily, I think, I mean, we can learn from each other. And another area where there's a lot to exchange, and we can take the best out of what we're doing both sides. I think colonialism is not a very fruitful prisma to look at what's happening now and the perceptions. Again, I think the danger is not that Italy is being seen by the people in the Netherlands as a kind of playground for archaeologists and art lovers. A whole of Europe is being seen as a kind of playground for the Chinese and then the people from India who come here and say, oh, very nice, but now we're going to produce something. So the problem is far bigger, and it should be another stimulus to join forces and create this not common European identity. That's not a European identity, but we do have things in common. So let's work on that. Let's make jokes about the stereotypes, but let's try not to make our debates, our discussions be determined by the stereotypes.
And I think that's a very important point, and perhaps a very good point where we can close, or almost close, because I see that we're nearing the end of our time. We had a couple of comments, kind of asking about the role of a European news media, because I think a lot of people, picked up on your idea. And I think one thing that struck me is that finally, in this moment of the pandemic, we suddenly know a lot about each other. It's just that we know, just a set of really horrible statistics. For the very first time, we are keenly aware of what is happening in other European capitals, but it is, told through the number of hospitalizations, the number of deaths, and, this moment that we are all sharing. The hope would be that, that sort of knowledge, that sort of exchange would remain beyond the crisis and would not only be narrated in this common experience of the pandemic. And, as both of you were saying, I think there's a lot of work to be done. So thank you for getting us started on thinking about what can be done. I think, certainly a lot of good ideas. Thank you to our attendees who stayed with us for quite a while, and also this late hour. I mean, depending on your geographical and cultural positioning, we had a bit of a kind of discussion of stereotypes of when to begin. I mean, this is still quite early in Mediterranean times. So thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for your very interesting contributions and questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Please feel free in getting in touch with us later on. Thank you to Lisa Saris at the ACES office for helping us host this event and manage the rather complicated technicalities. Thank you to the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome for being our co-host, and we hope to be able to start some of this work of battling stereotypes also in person in the months in the year to come. So thanks once more, and especially to our panelists. Massimiliano, Mark, thank you for taking the time to be with us. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Louisa. That's